Dr. Walker, thank you so much for speaking to NDTV. We talk at a time when there is expectation of some sort of a proposal that may be on the table to end the almost 3-year-long Russia-Ukraine war. In your assessment, when the meeting takes place and when the proposal does come about, as someone who's been part of the previous Trump administration, how hopeful are you that there will be some sort of a negotiated settlement to this war?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I don't think there is a concrete plan on the table just yet. I think this is really some of the very beginning of pressing parties to come to the table, particularly pressing Vladimir Putin to come to the table and to try to stop the war, to agree to a ceasefire. I frankly am very optimistic about getting a ceasefire this year. That is to say, an end to the fighting. I think the Russians need that. I think the Ukrainians want that. And I think President Trump is going to push for that. As for a final agreement on a settlement, I am very skeptical that we will ever get there. Putin's plans, Putin's desires are to eliminate Ukraine as a state. He doesn't want to see a sovereign, independent Ukraine. He doesn't believe that Ukrainians are an independent people, that he thinks that they're all Russians. And so I don't think he's going to agree to anything that's reasonable at all. So we may end up in a situation that is based on an end of the fighting and then deterrence against Russian future attacks, and then integrating Ukraine into the rest of Europe. So we have sort of an uneasy peace rather than a final settlement.
Come as that may be, that whatever may be some sort of a peace formula that may be agreed upon, even if it's far from optimal or perfect, do you think that could really sort of put an end to the long drawn war and work towards some sort of a long term settlement is not the right word, but some sort of a negotiated peace agreement that all parties may be open to? And the reason why I ask you this is because this is coming in the backdrop of Pete Hegseth's comments, which said that Ukraine is not going to enter NATO, there's not going to be any American troops in Ukraine, and going back to the 2014 border is now absolutely unlikely. In the backdrop of those comments, and in the backdrop of a settlement that may be far from optimal, what do you think would be the future of Russia, Ukraine, and Europe equation vis-a-vis US?
Right. So since then, Vice President Vance has clarified that that's not taking any options off the table. All options are on the table. As for NATO membership, that's not something that should be discussed with Russia. That is something only for Ukraine and NATO to discuss. It's not any of Russia's business. As for the 2014 borders, President Zelensky has said that it's not realistic to retake the territory militarily at this time, and that Ukraine is prepared to have a ceasefire and to pursue the return of its territory by other means, political, diplomatic, and so forth. So it is the commentary about this in public has been, I think, as if Hegseth or the United States is giving things away. That doesn't seem to me to be what's actually happening. As for the future, and to your question, I think it really comes down to containment of Russia. It is deterring Russia from future attacks. Vladimir Putin believes that Russia has a right to be an empire, believes it has a right to own territory that belongs to other people. He has tried to take this militarily, and he is continuing to try to do that. And I think the only thing we can do is make sure there is enough presence to stop him.
As someone who's been part of the Trump administration earlier, as someone who understands how President Trump works in terms of key issues and decisions like this, you've mentioned again and again about containing Putin. How will that happen? How will President Trump's administration try and achieve that?
Yeah, I think what they want to do is first just stop the fighting, get people settled into a position where they're not actively fighting. Then you're going to look at security assurances for Ukraine. A number of countries have already drafted some of these. These include training, equipping, possibly even a troop presence in Ukraine. And I think what President Trump wants to do is put as much of that burden on our European allies as possible. The U.S. can play a backup role, maybe provide air support, maybe provide enablers, but he wants the Europeans to take on more of the burden. So I'll repeat it again: ceasefire, deterrence, burden sharing. That's what I think he's trying to achieve. And as long as the U.S. remains part of that equation, even if it's not the lead role, but a backup role, the hope is that Vladimir Putin would believe it's real and therefore not attack again. And this would allow President Trump in the United States to focus more on Asia, which is what they see as the growing security challenge for the world.
In fact, Secretary of Defense also said that he wants to put the troops away from some of these regions because he wants to focus on Asia. You mentioned about the fact that the burden may be shifted more to Europe and America may provide air support. In that context, how do you see some of the European leaders saying that you cannot take us off the negotiating table, and that's a departure from the previous regimes and previous administration's approach, which was to have the European leaders also on the table?
Right. I don't think anyone is off the table. I think that's, again, a mischaracterization. What we see here is President Trump having met with President Zelensky twice this autumn, had a bunch of phone calls as well. He has spoken with various European leaders. Vice President Vance and Secretary Rubio are here in Munich meeting with European leaders and foreign ministers. So there's a lot of communication and dialogue going on. And it's in that context that Trump, of course, has also called Vladimir Putin to urge him to end the war and to start a negotiation process. So I don't think anyone's left out of this.
The UK Prime Minister, Mr. Keir Starmer, did mention that he made a comment regarding Ukraine's membership to NATO. He said now that's irreversible. And several European leaders have expressed their dissatisfaction about President Trump reaching out directly to President Putin and sort of leaving them out when it comes to these important negotiations. How do you see that? Because this has long-term ramifications for Europe. It has long-term ramifications for how this, whatever may be the peace formula that may be agreed upon, needs to really be implemented.
Yeah, of course, everybody has a stake in this. No one more than the Ukrainians, but also all of Europe, all of the NATO allies, all of Central Europe, United States as well. So everyone is being consulted. There are meetings happening all over the place. When Secretary Hegseth made those comments, he was in Brussels at a meeting of NATO defense ministers. We have many leaders here in Munich now. There'll be a foreign ministers meeting with Secretary Rubio soon. So these things will take place.
Final two questions to you, sir. You've been very you've given us a complete overload and a download actually of how far this could really stretch going forward. How do you see President Putin and President Trump's relationship going forward after whatever may be the settlement formula that's agreed upon? That's the nitty-gritties of it. How do you see the Russia-US relationship post this?
This is a very good question, because I think what President Trump is focused on is stabilizing the relationship with Russia. I think he is concerned about the spread of war. Russia's already attacked Georgia, has troops in Moldova, attacked Ukraine, has nuclear weapons and threatens to use them once in a while, has been involved in supporting Iran, has been in Syria, supported attacks on Israel. So he's trying to unwind that violence and therefore deal with President Putin. I think President Trump's calculation is you got to have a relationship with him to do that. That is going to be troubling to a number of European leaders who see the war crimes that Russia has committed, the rape, torture, abduction of children, and so forth. And they're going to have a hard time treating Putin as a normal interlocutor as long as he's in power in Russia. But that's something to be decided in the future. Again, at this stage, I think what President Trump is really focused on is getting an end to the fighting in Ukraine.
Final question: how do you see the Russia-China relationship getting evolved if the war ends? Because for that, that means from Chinese interests also, it would mean that American focus would come back to China. The Russia-North Korea relationship will see a complete change. So how do you see that evolving going forward?
Well, I think what we already see is that China is the big player and the stronger player, and Russia is in a bit of a dependent position, needing to trade with China, needing to sell energy to China, needing Chinese goods, in a much weaker position, much more dependent. And I think if there is an end to this war in Ukraine, China will remain in quite a strong position, and it's going to take Russia a generation to recover from the damage that they have inflicted on their own economy. So it'll still be Russia in a much more junior position and China acting very independently.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Volker, for taking out the time to decode what is really going to be a very historic decision, if at all it does happen.